a cold-blooded murder of a 39-year-old mother by her 17-year-old son. And it's not just a singular murder, but as we got into the investigation, we found that about a year and a half, maybe a year and 8 months, 9 months earlier, he murdered his father in Oklahoma. So let me tell you about this.
In today's documentary on Dark Bonds, we are stepping into a case that defies belief. A story so unsettling it will leave you questioning everything. A son who ended his father's life, then, just 18 months later, did the same to his mother. Yet, against all odds, he walked out of court a free man. Not once, but twice. How did he manage this? Was he truly innocent, caught in a web of circumstances beyond his control? Or did he skillfully manipulate the system, slipping through legal loopholes to avoid consequences? These are the questions we unravel tonight, the chilling case of Collin Griffith. But before we dive into the details of what happened, it's essential to understand the ones at the heart of this tragedy, especially his mother, because her story, her life, will shape everything we uncover tonight. Her name was Catherine Griffith, a woman who fought through life's struggles only to face a fate no one could have predicted. Born in 1985 in Shawnee, Oklahoma, Catherine entered the world with the odds already stacked against her. Her father, Rebert Willantis, walked away while she was still a child, never looking back. To him, she was nothing more than an afterthought, a burden. Her mother, Susan Detman, once said that he referred to her as damaged goods, words that Catherine would carry like a scar, though she never let him define her. Despite a childhood filled with abandonment and hardship, Catherine was never the type to give up. She dreamed of a life beyond the small town she grew up in. She wanted to travel, to see the world, to experience everything life had to offer. At just 15 years old, she met Charles Griffith, her first love, a high school romance that, for a time, seemed like the escape she had always longed for. Their relationship led to the birth of their first son, Christopher, while Catherine was still a teenager. Determined to create a stable home for her child, she married Charles and remained in Shawnee, building a life around the only world she knew. Catherine worked as an online teacher, a job that allowed her to spend more time with Christopher. She dedicated herself to motherhood, balancing work with raising her son. 7 years later, their family grew when she gave birth to Collin, her second child. Even then, she continued working from home, determined to provide the best life possible for her children. But behind closed doors, her marriage was far from a fairy tale. Charles was not the man she had once fallen for. He was a rough, controlling man, his temper unpredictable. Catherine endured years of mistreatment, the walls of their home echoing with chaos. For 2 decades, she lived in a cycle of fear and hopelessness, until finally, she broke free. After 20 years, Catherine and Charles divorced. But even then, the past never truly let go. She chose to keep his last name, not out of love, but out of necessity. Every academic certification she had earned bore the name Griffith, and starting over under a different identity would mean erasing years of hard work. By the time the divorce was finalized, Christopher was 18 years old. Tired of witnessing the turmoil between his parents, he made the decision to leave, escaping a home that had been nothing but a battlefield. He cut ties and stepped into the world on his own, unwilling to endure another day in a house where his mother suffered endlessly. Collin, however, made a choice no one expected. At just 14 years old, he chose to stay with his father, the same man who had tormented his mother, the same man Christopher had fled from. It wasn't just about living with his father. It was about learning from him. Charles had always believed in discipline, in toughness, in survival, and with Collin, he made sure those lessons ran deep. He trained his son in hand-to-hand combat, survival skills, and most of all, how to handle a firearm. Meanwhile, Catherine was rebuilding her life. She left Shawnee behind and moved to Charlotte County, Florida, where she began teaching at a local school. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. She loved her job. She connected with her students. She was finally living for herself, but fate had other plans, and Catherine had no idea that the darkest chapter of her life was just beginning. Catherine had always loved to travel. It was her escape, her way of feeling alive, and in late 2022, during a cruise trip, fate introduced her to Richard, a well-known content creator on YouTube. His channel focused on cruise experiences, finance, and gambling. From the very first moment, their connection was effortless. Catherine, after years of hardship, desperately needed a fresh start. something that began with a simple smile. And Richard? He was known for his light-hearted personality, always cracking jokes, always making people laugh. For Catherine, that energy was exactly what she needed. Richard saw her as warm, kind, and full of life. When they first met, she introduced herself as a single mother with a 14-year-old son who lived with his father but visited her occasionally. She spoke about Collin often, so often that Richard felt like he knew him. She adored her son, but at times she confided in Richard about the struggles she faced during his visits. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened on February 14th, 2023. By that time, their relationship had hit a pause. They were on a break, giving each other space. That day, Richard, always playful, sent Catherine an angry teddy bear as a joke. He expected maybe a chuckle in return or a sarcastic message, but what he received instead shook him to his core. His phone rang. It was Catherine. When he answered, her voice was nothing like before, shaken, hollow, a tone he'd never heard from her. She said to him that she at the airport and she is flying to Oklahoma. "Collin shot his father," she said. Richard barely had time to process what he just heard before a message came through. It was a link to a freshly published news article. The headline confirmed everything. This was it. The first crime committed by Collin Griffith. February 14th, 2023. A desperate 911 call was made in Oklahoma. On the line was a 15-year-old boy, his voice trembling, his breath unsteady. Through his sobs, he confessed he had taken his father's life. He insisted it was self-defense. Authorities from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation and local deputies rushed to the scene, a quiet house on East 900 Road. But when they arrived, they found only two people inside, Collin Griffith, and the lifeless body of his father. Lying on the ground was 43-year-old Charles Griffith, shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. It was precise, calculated, a method of firing that, according to Richard, it was exactly how Charles had trained his son to shoot in their self-defense lessons. Investigators were met with a bizarre scene. At first, they viewed Collin as a scared teenager, a child who had just survived a terrifying encounter. But something about him didn't fit the image of a panicked boy acting in self-defense. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was calm, too calm. Even when one of the officers, trying to lighten the mood, casually asked him what kind of video games he enjoyed, Collin's response was unsettlingly cold. Strategy games. And then, silence. Collin was taken into custody and charged with first-degree homicide. The court set his bail at $50,000, a number that seemed almost insignificant for the weight of the crime. At the time, Catherine was already in Oklahoma, doing what any mother would, standing by her son. But unlike other parents caught in such a nightmare, she knew something no one else did. She knew about his plan. She knew that Collin had spoken more than once about wanting his father gone. She knew about the doorbell camera recordings where Collin openly stated his intentions. And yet, when the time came, she paid the bail, $50,000. She walked her son out of jail. What happened next changed everything. When Collin Griffith stood before the judge, his defense was simple. "I was protecting myself." But the key to his freedom wasn't just his words. It was his father's past. Charles Griffith's history of aggression became the centerpiece of the trial. The jury saw not just a victim, but a violent man with a documented record of harm. This wasn't a case of an innocent father and a guilty son. It was framed as a tragic necessity. And in Oklahoma, a recent legal change worked in Collin's favor. Before 2018, self-defense claims required the accused to prove they had no choice but to act. But after a revision in state law, the burden of proof shifted to the police. Now, it was up to the authorities to prove the act wasn't self-defense. But the evidence wasn't there. With no physical proof contradicting Collin's claim, and a father with a violent history, the court had no choice. The charges were dropped. Collin Griffith walked free. But only two people in the world knew the truth, Catherine and her son. Because beyond the courtroom walls, beyond the legal arguments and dropped charges, Catherine knew exactly what had happened that day. Richard later recounted what Catherine had told him. On the day of the incident, Collin had sat across from his father, and in a moment of brutal honesty, he revealed something deeply personal. He told his father that he is gay, but his father's reaction was immediate. Charles exploded, and what started as an argument escalated into something much worse. The house, already a place of tension, became a battleground. And in that moment, 2 gunshots rang out, one to the chest, one to the head. Charles Griffith never got back up. Catherine had known this, and yet she still chose to stand by her son. She paid for his release. She fought to see him walk free. What she didn't realize was that in doing so, she had just sealed her own fate. From this moment on, Catherine Griffith entered a new battle, one that no mother should ever have to fight. She had fought for Collin's freedom. She had ignored every warning sign, silenced every doubt, and believed in him despite knowing the truth. But now, she was faced with something far more terrifying. How do you raise a son when you know he's capable of taking a life? After Collin Griffith's release, authorities invoked the Baker Act, a law that allows individuals to be detained against their will for psychiatric evaluation and treatment if they are considered a risk to themselves or others. For a time, Collin was confined, his mind analyzed by professionals trying to determine what lay beneath his unsettling calm. Meanwhile, Catherine was unraveling. She had spent her life surviving. A childhood filled with abandonment, a marriage filled with mistreatment. Now, she was left with the weight of a son who had taken a life and walked free. The pressure was unbearable. More than once she tried to escape it. Her mother, Susan Detman, had witnessed it all. The downward spiral, the desperation, the moments where Catherine's emotions turned volatile, explosive, unpredictable. There were fights, shouting matches, terrifying breakdowns, and each time it became clearer, Catherine wasn't okay. More than once, authorities forced her into psychiatric evaluation under the Baker Act. Each time she was pulled back from the edge. But was this truly a mental illness? Or was it simply the weight of a life that had been nothing but one battle after another? 6 months passed. Collin was released. But instead of returning to the life he wanted, authorities sent him to live with his mother in Auburndale, Florida. He didn't want to go. He told them outright. He didn't want to live with her. But the question was, why? Did he truly hate her? Or was it something deeper? Was he afraid? Afraid that she knew too much? Afraid that she was the only one who had seen through him? Regardless of what he felt, the decision had been made. Mother and son were reunited. Catherine, despite everything, wanted to rebuild. She wanted to give Collin a fresh start. She tried everything to prove that she was a good mother, that she loved him. She bought him a brand new Volkswagen, a $26,000 gift for his high school graduation. She took him on trips around the world, trying to rewrite their story. Their last trip together was to Australia, a getaway meant to be a new beginning. But Collin wasn't like her. He wasn't trying to heal. He wasn't trying to rebuild. His behavior was growing darker. Richard, the one person Catherine confided in, began to receive disturbing messages. In one, she wrote something chilling. He tried to stab me in the neck with a pencil. Richard saw everything. The warning signs, the tension, the fear creeping into Catherine's words. He even tried to reach out to Collin, to befriend him, to understand him. But Collin's cold stare and eerie silence made it impossible. There was something there, something unnatural, something dangerous. One day, the principal of Collin's school received a report that sent shockwaves through the staff. Collin had told someone that his mother had held a gun to her head and asked him to pull the trigger. The school immediately called the police. An investigation followed. But there was one problem. Collin was lying. There was no gun, no threat, just a carefully crafted story. Why? Was it just a troubled teenager acting out? Or was it something far more calculated? Was this the first step in a much bigger plan? Catherine and Collin continued living under the same roof, but things were not okay. She wanted to believe in him. She wanted to save him, but deep down she was afraid. And more than once she lost control too. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a woman drowning in fear, exhaustion, and regret. There were nights when her own anger took over. She would lash out at Collin, yell at him, fight with him. Was it desperation? Or was it because, somewhere deep down, she already knew how this story would end? She just didn't know when. Catherine Griffith had spent her entire life fighting battles alone, but in one final attempt to reclaim some sense of normalcy, she made a decision that surprised everyone. She reached out to her father. For most of her life, Rebert Willantis had been nothing more than a shadow, a man who abandoned her as a child, never looking back. Her mother, Susan Detman, had always resented him. She had spent years warning Catherine to forget about him, but Catherine wouldn't. Despite everything, she was determined to let him back in. Why? Was she hoping that bringing her father into Collin's life would somehow fill the void? That maybe, just maybe, family could fix what was broken? Or was she simply tired of being alone? Regardless of her reasons, Robert Willantis returned, and though his presence seemed insignificant at first, it would later become a key piece in unraveling the darkest secrets of this story. Because Collin told him things that no one else knew, terrifying things. Then came the night the police were called. A distress call came from Catherine's home reporting an assault. The suspect? Her own son. Officers rushed to the scene. When they arrived, they found Collin Griffith, eerily calm as always. He had his story ready. He told them that his mother had attacked him first, that she had lost her temper because he refused to stop playing video games. But the scene told a different story. Catherine was bruised, shaken. The truth. Collin had overpowered her, thrown her down, hurt her, all because she had tried to take his game away. His grandmother, Susan Detman, had seen it all. She told the police exactly what happened.
I was saying, Mom, I'm not a psychopath, I'm not this murderer, I'm just trying to peacefully leave or peacefully coexist and just figure something out. And she kept telling me to shut up, and when I wouldn't shut up, she hit me.
No, that's not what happened, Collin. That's not what happened. You never said you wanted to peacefully coexist.
I've been saying that.
Collin had attacked his mother. As Collin was being handcuffed, he turned to his grandmother and said something that made her blood run cold. "I'm not psycho. I just want to live in peace." Just like before, Collin was released the next day, but authorities weren't willing to take chances. Once again, he was placed under the Baker Act.
But I struggle with a kid that's being released from jail and saying, if you bring me back there, she's gonna die.
If we don't do something, then,
Shame on us.
Yeah, then we're not.
Shame on us that
then
we
we
didn't do our
failed.
job and we failed you. And I'm not failing you. Nor am I going to fail your son.
This time for 6 months. But something changed during this confinement. When his time was up, Collin refused to go home. He told the authorities something disturbing. "If you send me back to my mother, either I'll end her life, or I'll end my own." The implications were clear. Was this just the words of a troubled teenager? Or was it another calculated move? Because whether he realized it or not, these statements, these claims that his mother was unstable, would later play a critical role in what was to come. Then came the escape. Collin ran away from home. He found refuge with his grandmother. And when authorities finally caught up to him, he made his intentions terrifyingly clear. He said, "If you send me back to her, I will kill her or kill myself." With that statement, the authorities had no choice but to hand him over to Florida's Department of Children and Families, DCF. DCF sent him back to his mother, back into the very home where he had already made his intentions known. Catherine Griffith had spent her life trying to protect her son, but she had no idea she had just been handed a death sentence. The tension between Catherine and her mother, Susan Detman, had been building for months. Catherine believed that Susan spoiled Collin, that she shielded him too much, letting him escape responsibility. He needed to grow up. He needed to face consequences. But Susan disagreed. The arguments between mother and daughter escalated until Catherine cut ties completely. She blocked her mother's number, blocked her on social media. She didn't want interference. This was her son, her battle. She would handle it alone. Despite everything, Catherine never stopped trying. Collin told her he wanted to study cybersecurity, a new goal, a future, a reason to move forward. And like always, Catherine was ready to give. She reached out to Richard, asking for advice on buying a high-performance computer for her son. She wanted to support his education. She wanted to believe that this time things would be different. That conversation took place just 5 days before the end. 5 days before everything unraveled. It was a Sunday, a normal day. Catherine asked Collin to clean his room and take out the trash. A simple request. A request every mother makes. But Collin wasn't like every son. An argument broke out. Frustrated, Catherine left for work, giving him space to cool down. But when she returned home later that day, Collin was gone. Again, he had run to his grandmother's house. Catherine, exhausted by the cycle, sent angry messages to her mother. "He needs to come back. If he doesn't, I'll report him for violating his probation." But Collin didn't come back. And so, at 4 p.m., Catherine drove to her mother's house to bring him home herself. Neighbors saw what happened next. A heated argument in front of the house. Catherine's voice sharp with frustration. Then, in an act that sent shock through the entire neighborhood, Collin grabbed his mother by the hair. He dragged her inside. And from that moment on, Catherine Griffith was never seen alive again. 2 hours passed. The quiet neighborhood was disrupted by the sound of police sirens. Squad cars surrounded Susan Detman's home. Officers rushed to the front door, and there, standing outside, was Collin Griffith, expressionless, unshaken. He looked at the officers and said only 2 words. "I know my rights. I want a lawyer." Inside the house, the scene was something out of a nightmare. On the floor, Catherine Griffith lay motionless. A deep wound ran across her neck, a wound so brutal, so final, that there was no chance of survival. Beside her, a 12-inch knife lay on the ground, the same weapon that had taken her life. When officers questioned Collin, his response was as chilling as his demeanor. She fell on the knife. The truth was clear. The teenager who had taken his father's life just 18 months earlier had done it again. Only this time, there would be no release. No dropped charges. No bail. This time, the system wouldn't fail. Brian Haas, the state attorney for the 10th Judicial Circuit of Florida, made a swift decision.
State Attorney for the 10th Judicial Circuit of Florida. The Polk County Grand Jury indicted Collin Griffith on the charge of first-degree murder for the killing of his mother in Auburndale last week. I made the decision to charge this 17-year-old as an adult based upon the egregious facts and circumstances of this case. Charging a minor as an adult is not a decision that I take lightly, but as state attorney, it is my responsibility to do so when warranted. There have been many questions regarding an incident from Oklahoma last year where Collin Griffith killed his father. While I have been informed that charges were not brought in that case, Polk County law enforcement continues to work with the authorities in Oklahoma to be sure they are provided all relevant information and evidence that will allow them to continue to evaluate their case as they deem necessary. The Polk County, Florida murder charge will now move on to an arraignment. My prosecutors and the deputies from the Polk County Sheriff's Office will continue to work together to pursue justice in this case and hold Collin Griffith accountable for his murder.
Collin Griffith would be charged as an adult based on the extreme nature of this case. Because this was never about self-defense. This was never about fear. This was about a son who had eliminated both of his parents and walked free once before. This time, justice would not let him walk free again. After his arrest, Collin Griffith was taken to the Polk County Detention Center. Unlike his first encounter with the law, there was no bail set. The only person who had ever fought for his release, his mother, was gone. This case was unlike anything Florida had seen before. A teenage son who had ended his father's life, then, 18 months later, took his mother's. Every legal expert assumed Collin's defense would follow one predictable strategy, a claim that his mental state was compromised due to his repeated confinements under the Baker Act. The argument was simple. He wasn't in control of his actions. But Amy Thornhill, Collin's newly appointed defense attorney, had a very different plan, and no one saw it coming. The trial of Collin Griffith began in Bartow, Florida on February 4th, 2025. The charges? First-degree homicide and kidnapping. The outcome? Unbelievable. Because what happened inside that courtroom would shock everyone. Attorney Amy Thornhill made her first move by erasing Collin's past from the courtroom. She argued that since the Oklahoma courts had dismissed Collin's first case, it was legally irrelevant to the current trial. The judge agreed. This meant that in the eyes of the court, Collin's first homicide was no longer part of the narrative. Instead, it was only referenced as a previous self-defense case, not as the moment he ended his own father's life. With one legal maneuver, Amy Thornhill had rewritten history. Then came the second blow. Amy Thornhill shifted the focus away from Collin entirely and onto Catherine Griffith herself. She presented hundreds of messages between Catherine and Collin, messages filled with anger, frustration, and desperation. The same texts Catherine had sent in an attempt to bring her son home. They were now being used as proof that she was emotionally abusive. Then came the third and most devastating strike. Amy Thornhill proved that Catherine owned a firearm. This seemingly small detail changed everything. It validated the claim Collin had made months earlier at school, that his mother had once pointed a gun at herself and told him to pull the trigger. Suddenly, Catherine was no longer just a victim. She was now being portrayed as a dangerous, unstable woman who may have threatened her own son's life. Then came the final and most crushing piece of evidence. Catherine's own mother, Susan Detman, testified against her. Susan confirmed that Catherine had tried to end her own life multiple times. 6 times. She described her daughter's unpredictable mood swings, her fits of rage, her struggles with mental health. The jury listened to audio recordings from Catherine's own Ring camera, capturing moments where she yelled at Collin, scolded him, lost her temper.
You told me you were going to get your neighbor over there, or I'm sending the police. Do you want the police to go? Then you would rather have the police go. Okay, that's fine. That's the only answer I needed. I will not take a call from you after this ever again. If Collin's not here by 10 o'clock, I'm dead to you. Do you understand me? Do you understand me? Do you understand me? Do you understand me? Yes or no? I need a yes or no. Yes or no? Do you understand me? Okay. You don't understand me.
Then came the 911 call, Collin's voice trembling as he followed the dispatcher's instructions, desperately trying to save his mother's life, or at least, that's how it was presented. In a brilliant move, Amy Thornhill made sure Collin never testified in court. In most self-defense cases, defendants take the stand to plead their case, to show remorse, emotion, and fear. But Collin's expressionless face would have ruined everything. Instead, he waived his right to testify. While the jury listened to the 911 call, Collin was removed from the courtroom, so they never saw his reaction. A move so calculated, so precisely executed, that it became one of the most critical decisions of the trial.
Mr. Griffith has elected to waive his presence in the courtroom during the publication of State's 165.
State Prosecutor Mark Levine fought back with every tool he had. He painted a horrific picture of what had really happened to Catherine Griffith, with the autopsy report in hand, which proved that Catherine was stabbed with the knife, and the wound was 8 inches length, which proved that Collin was lying, and his mother didn't fall on the knife as he claimed. He stabbed her with such force, Levine told the court, that the blade tore through her throat, her esophagus, her trachea, until it pierced the other side. She bled profusely, and while she was bleeding out on the floor, her son just stood there, watching. Then came the testimony from Catherine's father, Robert Willantis. He told the court that Collin had confessed his hatred for his mother, that he had detailed exactly how he would end her life, that he had done it exactly as he had described. Neighbors testified that on the day of the crime, they witnessed a violent argument between mother and son, ending with Collin dragging Catherine inside by her hair. The prosecution argued, can this be self-defense when he was the one who attacked first? But under Florida's self-defense laws, the prosecution faced an impossible challenge. The burden wasn't on Collin Griffith to prove he acted in self-defense. The burden was on the prosecution to prove that he didn't, and that was the fatal flaw in the case. In a ruthless yet highly effective move, Amy Thornhill discredited Catherine's father in front of the jury. She asked him one simple question. Did you attend your daughter's funeral? His answer? No. That was all it took. In that moment, his credibility was shattered. The jury no longer saw him as a grieving father seeking justice. They saw him as a man who had abandoned his daughter, both in life and in death. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. 6 women, 4 men, and when they returned to the courtroom, their decision left Florida in shock. Not guilty. 5 days. That's all it took. 5 days of arguments. 5 days of evidence. 5 days to decide the fate of a teenager who had taken both of his parents' lives. And on the final day, February 9th, 2025, the verdict was delivered. On the same day of the verdict, cameras captured the now 17-year-old Collin Griffith walking out of the courtroom, alone. There was no family waiting for him, no grandmother. For the first time in his life, he had no one left. In a shocking phone interview, his grandmother's husband expressed his fear and disbelief at the court's decision. This case shocked Florida. It divided opinions. Some believed the jury followed the law, that there simply wasn't enough evidence to disprove self-defense. But others saw it as a catastrophic failure of the justice system. A teenager had taken the lives of both his parents, one after another, and walked free. Was this justice? Or was this the perfect loophole, exploited not once, but twice? Was the verdict fair? Or did Collin Griffith escape justice once again? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. See you in the next video.